such a great privilege and honor to be here with you this morning. And what I'd like to do is talk for about 20 minutes or so before we open it up to Q&A about how the world looks from the point of view of someone who's been a journalist for many decades, has traveled all over the world, and has read political philosophy and try to merge it all together. How I kind of analyze the world. Let me start this way. We live at a time of traditional geopolitical competition, but this geopolitical competition is being played out in a very untraditional landscape of globalization and technology transfers. And what this means is that each part of the world affects every other part of the world like never before. So that if America suffers, if the United States suffers a kind of dent to its reputation for power, or an insult to its reputation for power in Southeast Asia, that affects America's reputation for power in Europe and in the Middle East, and vice versa. And this happens as never before. Technology has not negated geography. All that's happened is that technology has shrunk geography so that it's made geography more claustrophobic, so that the fights over patches of ground are more fractious than ever before. Territory means more than it's ever before for the people who are fighting over it. And each part of the world interlocks with every other. Nevertheless, to give you an insight into what's going on globally, I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the Middle East. Then I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the Asia Pacific, and then I'm going to end up with a discussion about Europe. Let me start with the Middle East. The Middle East, in 2015, has seen 3 systems of imperial order collapse. The first system collapsed in 1918 at the end of World War I. This was the Ottoman Turkish imperial system, which kept a relative stability in the region all the way from what is now Algeria to all the way to what is now the Iran-Iraq border. Yes, there were sectarian struggles. Yes, there were ethnic struggles, but they were muted. And the reason why they were muted was because everyone was a subject of the Turkish Sultan in Constantinople. And so because everyone was a subject of the Sultan, it mattered less who controlled what territory where. The Ottoman imperial system collapsed, and frankly, almost 100 years later, the Middle East has still not found an adequate replacement to it, or doesn't know how to deal with the collapse of that. After World War I, you had the British and French imperial systems. They carved up borders, creating the borders of modern-day Iraq, modern-day Syria. They separated Lebanon from Syria, Jordan from Syria. They created borders in what's called the Levant and Mesopotamia. That area of the Middle East between the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea and the Iranian plateau. And again, the Europeans did not end all ethnic and sectarian disputes, but they muted them and damped them down to a significant extent because they were in control. And their rule may not have been democratic, it may not have been civil or humanitarian in every sense, but they governed and they kept stability. That system ended too after World War II, and from a few years after World War II into the early 1960s, the French and the British colonial systems essentially ended. But that gave way to something else, an American order of sorts. Now, Americans do not like to define themselves as an empire. Nevertheless, considering the reach of the American military, the American diplomatic service, the American economy, the United States has been, during the Cold War and after, an empire in all but name. In the sense that the challenges and frustrations it faces, its military and diplomatic leaders face, are similar and comparable to those of empires going back hundreds of years. Now, in the last few years, this American system has weakened in the Middle East, in the sense that the United States does not seek to order reality directly on the ground. It seeks to have a much less heavy-handed footprint. Rather than do the balancing completely on its own in the region, it wants regional powers themselves to do the balancing. So, empower Saudi Arabia, let the Turks be stronger, deal with Iran, negotiate with Iran, build up Egypt, and let some regional powers emerge that the United States can then work with. So that's the end of the American imperial system and the rise of indigenous powers. But then there's something else. Why didn't the Middle East collapse into chaos at the end of the European imperial system? That's because the Europeans gave way to what I call post-imperial strongmen. Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, the Assad family in Syria since 1970, a string of military rulers in Iraq that culminated with Saddam Hussein in the late 1970s, and these people ruled too. Now, because they had to rule according to artificial borders set up by the Europeans, and that did not configure with sectarian and ethnic borders, they had to create secular state identities. And because these states were so artificial, the only way to do that was to rule through a particular suffocating form of ideology and authoritarianism, whereby there was nothing. They had eviscerated all forms of political order and political associations between the regime on top and the tribe and extended family on the bottom. So that when these rulers collapsed, by American design in the case of Iraq, by indigenous design in the case of Syria and to a lesser extent Libya, there was nothing left. There were no institutions, no bureaucracy, no political associations left, because when the carapace of tyranny at the top collapsed, there was nothing but the tribe and extended family on the bottom. And that's where we are now. After the collapse and erosion of three imperial and imperial-like systems, we are in a state of comparative chaos in the Middle East, particularly in Libya and in Syria and in Iraq. Now, in breaking up the Middle East further, you have two kinds of countries. You have what I call, in geographical terms, age-old clusters of civilization, like Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, where the borders more or less configure with ancient Roman civilizations, ancient Carthage, the Nile Valley, etc. These were always states in one form or another, going back to antiquity. And because they were real states, or at least more real than Libya, Syria, and Iraq and Yemen, they required less authoritarian rule. They had dictators, they had kings, but they did not rule as oppressively as the rulers of these other places, Syria, Iraq, and Libya. And because they did not rule as oppressively, because the king of Morocco, the pharaonic, the Nasserite pharaohs of Egypt, the secular rulers of Tunisia since Habib Bourguiba, etc., because they did not rule so oppressively, they allowed intermediary levels of political organization between the regime and the family. And so when they collapsed, there was still order. The divisions in a place like Egypt or Tunisia are divisions about who rules and what kind of a regime we will have. But there's no question that the state exists. that there is a state. Whereas Libya, which is essentially whereas Libya, Iraq, and Syria were not age-old clusters of civilization at all. They were merely vague geographical expressions. So when their states, their suffocating authoritarian regimes collapsed, there was nothing there. And the question is, does the state at all in the first place exist? And that's the situation we are in now in the Middle East. Now let me move over to East Asia, where we have the reverse challenge. In East Asia, you have very strong states. The disputes in the South and East China Sea are disputes that go back centuries, but we've only read about them really for the last 10 years or so. Why is that? That's because in the early and middle phases of the Cold War, all of these states were internally preoccupied. China, first in a very negative, cruel way with the depredations of Mao Zedong, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, then in a positive way through building the economy, through Deng Xiaoping. But again, both of those, whether it was negative or positive, were internally focused. Vietnam and Malaysia, as you know, were involved in internal wars and rebellions and communist insurgencies for decades. So those places were internally focused. Same with the Philippines. As for Japan, it was in a state of quasi-pacifism as an aftershock of the bad experience with militarism during World War II. And that went on for decades. So Japan was very neutered in a way in terms of how it conceived of its military. South Korea was just building up an infrastructure and a state which started with the industrialization under Park Chung-hee in the latter decades of the 20th century. But now, lo and behold, all these states have bureaucratized, they've institutionalized, they're at peace at home, and because of the success of capitalism for decades on end, they've been able to develop their own military-industrial complexes, particularly air forces and navies. And with air forces and navies and peace and stability and strong institutions at home, countries like Vietnam, China, Malaysia, Japan can press outward. And pressing outward, lo and behold, they find they have these disputes in the blue waters of the East and South China Seas, which are blue water extensions of the Asian continental mainland. And that's the reason why in this particular phase of history, we face these volatile disputes. Now, why is China so intent on dominating the South China Sea? It's a lesson in geography again. China looks at the South China Sea very much like the United States looked at the greater Caribbean in the 19th and early 20th century. When the United States gained effective strategic control of the greater Caribbean, because the Caribbean united the northern coast of South America with the southern coast of North America and the Gulf of Mexico, seizing effective strategic control of the greater Caribbean gave the United States effective strategic control of the Western Hemisphere. It made the United States a hemispheric power. And as a hemispheric power in the Western Hemisphere, the hegemon of the Western Hemisphere, it was then able to affect the balance of power in the Eastern Hemisphere. And that's what the history of the 20th century was all about. The United States tipping the balance in its favor in 2 world wars and the Cold War that followed. But it all began with the Caribbean. And that's how China looks at the South China Sea. For China, the South China Sea dominance there provides a gateway to the wider Pacific, and much more importantly, 2 other things. It allows them to further soften up Taiwan, which is never mentioned in the South China Sea disputes. But remember, Taiwan is the cork in the bottle. It's the northern part of the South China Sea. So effective Chinese dominance over the South China Sea enables China to continue to make an end run around Taiwanese sovereignty with ever having to fight a war against Taiwan. And finally, much more importantly, control or dominance, or at least parity with the United States Navy and Air Force in the South China Sea and East China Sea allows China entry in a big way into the Indian Ocean. Through the Strait, if you think of the Strait of Malacca as a metaphor for the Panama Canal and the other states, China is suddenly can go unimpeded into the Indian Ocean, which of course is the global energy interstate across which all the ships travel bringing oil and natural gas from the Middle East to the customers in East Asia. Also, the Indian Ocean encompasses the entire arc of Islam, from the Sahara Desert to the Indonesian and Malay archipelagos. So with where it is now in the South and East China Sea, China may be a world power in an economic sense, the second largest economy in the world, but it's only a regional power in a military sense. But if it can gain dominance over its adjacent marginal seas, that opens up the possibility for the Chinese Navy in future decades to operate in two oceans rather than one, and then be a world power, because it won't dominate the Eastern Hemisphere to the extent that the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere, but it will go a long way in that direction. And what the United States, the challenge for the United States in this geographical conundrum is to steer between two extremes. On the one hand, we cannot afford a military conflict with China for many reasons, one of which is that a war in the South China Sea would affect global markets and financial markets much more than a war in Iraq or Syria or something like that. So the United States must avoid a conflict in the South China Sea, a military one, but it also has to prevent formal and informal allies, whether the Philippines, Vietnam, etc., from being Finlandized by China. That is, where China gains control of the foreign and security policies of these countries to the extent that the Soviet Union gained control of the foreign and security policies of Finland during the Cold War. Finally, a few minutes on Europe. We all know about the Ukraine crisis. The Ukraine is traditionally a buffer state between Russia and Europe. Ukraine, for geographical reasons, will always matter more to Russia than it matters to Europe and certainly to the United States. That's the imbalance of interests that we have to deal with. The Ukraine is integral to Russia. It's where Russia began in the 9th century around the city of Kiev as a kind of where the Vikings overlapped with the Byzantines, so to speak. You know, Russia being a civilization that's part Viking, part Byzantine. But the Ukraine crisis opens up something larger, which is that everywhere in Central and Eastern Europe, from the Baltic states and Estonia in the north, down to the Balkan countries and Bulgaria in the south, and going eastward to the countries of the Caucasus in the east, this is sort of greater Central Eastern Europe. And the countries of this region have always been in between two imperialisms, between Germany and between Russia. German imperialism is no longer operable in the present sense. Germany is a benign economic power, pushes its weight around enormously, but in a more or less benign way and in a more or less in a purely economic way. Russia's a different story. And what these countries are worried about is that if the United States does not sufficiently project power into this region, into the Ukraine, limiting Russia's advance, then these countries, because they have they can't move, they are where they are, will have no choice but to make side deals with the Russians, make their peace with the Russians, more or less on Russia's terms, and this will undo the gains made at the end of the Cold War. And that's the drama being played out now behind the scenes, off the headlines. Countries like Romania, Poland, etc., are watching how the United States operates very, very closely. Because, and I'll end with this note, and it's a geographical note. If you were Poland or Romania in 1995, you were in utopia, in nirvana. History was left behind because you were going to join NATO. Eventually, you were going to get into the EU. NATO was strong, the EU was robust and getting richer by the year, and Russia was conveniently weak and chaotic over the incompetent, undisciplined rule of Boris Yeltsin. Fast forward to now, NATO's future is questionable because of the lack of commitment of member states to their own defense budgets. The EU is in tremendous disarray because of a fiscal crisis that has been going on now for almost half a decade, with Greece perhaps being lost. So the EU and NATO have less power projection, have less of a reputation for projection of power eastward. And Russia is no longer incompetently ruled. It's very competently ruled by someone who's disciplined, someone who has a very well-articulated geopolitical vision. It's a geopolitical vision we may not share, but it's one nevertheless that's coherent from a Russian point of view, which is to establish a traditional soft zone of influence in Central Eastern Europe, starting with Ukraine. And that's where we are now. It's a very difficult time in history, but I leave you with 3 lessons of empires from the past, which is caution, restraint, and strategic patience. Thank you very much.